I get asked quite often what GoPro settings I use to achieve certain shots, and to be honest, I'll be like, I basically use the same settings for everything, and I can tell you all of those right now. I've been using GoPros professionally for fun, for YouTube, for productions for quite a while now, and I've learned kind of like the settings that I like to have for this camera to get the best results out of it. The most important thing heading into this entire discussion is manage your exposure. So there's this principle called shutter angle. And shutter angle is the balance between your frame rate and your shutter speed. Managing that and figuring that out is the single most important thing to be getting the best shots possible out of GoPros. I'll explain to you how all of those things work, but I want to emphasize that if you learn nothing else from this video, it's properly manage exposure. Throughout all of this video, if you find any of this content useful or interesting, please consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell and all of that obnoxious YouTube stuff. We also have a membership thing available down over probably here that allows you to become basically a patron of this channel. I also have a Patreon, but please consider using all of these things. Spent a long time learning how to use these GoPros well. Really excited to share that information with you. And if you would consider giving back a little bit, that'd be super, super helpful and cool. So, without further ado, let's dive in. I'm going to apologize right now that the camera that I'm going to be using for this video is not very good quality. It's this little webcam. I needed to take this camera and use it as an overhead to show you like what's on the back of the GoPro, so I apologize in advance. One of mine's in the shop. It's coming back soon, and everything will be back to its normal quality very shortly. But in the meantime, enjoy. The point of the video today is to go through my GoPro settings. I've had a bunch of people ask recently, what settings do you use for GoPro? What do you use when you're filming for productions, So I just wanted to go through like a few different setups of my preferred GoPro settings. So this is my GoPro Hero 9, and we're going to go ahead and go through some of the settings that I've got on here. So for the primary thing that I use GoPros for these days, especially in a professional environment, is filming. And when I'm doing filming, almost all of the time, people want to see the real steady look. And for real steady, my settings are pretty simple. We go 2.7K. For some reason, when I filmed this, I omitted that it's in 4:3, so it's 2.7K 4:3. And what that does is it gives you a little bit extra on the top and bottom that you're not going to see in the normal 16:9 frame, to get extra information available for real steady to be able to make its cropping process a little bit better. You technically can run 16:9 video through real steady, but it ends up giving you a really, really, really wide video that's not 16:9 that you then have to crop in on. So best recommendation for real steady is shoot in 4:3 and not in 16:9. I'll ask a director or somebody how they want to shoot it. I like to do 60 because then you can kind of slow down any of those given moments and make it kind of spread out, right? Because like FPV drones move really fast, so if you can double the amount of time that you're going to be able to see each of those things, it's going to be maybe a better situation for some of those. For lens, for real steady, you always want to use wide. Real steady requires that you use wide, and so that's just the requirement. And then hyper smooth, you want to have all the way off. You do not want hyper smooth on if you're going to be planning on using real steady in post-production. Duration no limit timer off, zoom off, and then Protune is on. So I believe if this is off already, you have to turn Protune on. For bitrate, always high, so it uses a little bit more stuff, but it goes up to 100 megabits per second, so it gives you a little bit more detail. Shutter, you want to lock to double whatever your frame rate is. So if your frame rate is 60, I'm going to set it to 120. If your frame rate is 30, you set it to 60. But what's going to happen is that especially in a bright environment, as you look at the back of the camera, it's going to be overexposed. In order to fix that overexposure, you then use an ND filter. These neutral density filters are little pieces of glass that sit over top of the lens that allow only a certain amount of light through. So if you see this, as I hold it over here, this is an ND16. You can see that the camera, the amount of light that's coming through there is much darker. There's a lot less of it. And all this is doing is, it's basically sunglasses for your camera. And when this sits in front of the lens, this is for a Hero 8, not a Hero 9. It's what I had handy. When this sits over your lens, it reduces the amount of light and lowers that exposure, but allows you to keep the magic number of having a shutter of 120 when you're shooting at 60 FPS, or 1/60 when you're shooting at 30 FPS, or different increments for whatever thing's going on. That's important because it's the most natural look for a GoPro to see. So when you look at video that's like taken at sunset, for example, people, or maybe that you've taken at sunset, for example, that footage is going to end up looking a little bit better in general, half because of the way the light is hitting everything, but also because your GoPro is exposed a little bit better. It's probably going to be shooting at a much lower frame rate, and that gives you what we call motion blur. So what you'll notice is that things that are fixed in frame, like for example chasing something, are going to be really, really sharp, but everything else that's moving around you is going to be really, really blurry, and that's a really pleasing aesthetic. It's a desired aesthetic that people want to see when you're filming. So the most important thing with your shutter is to have your shutter basically double your frame rate, and then you want to expose down to the proper exposure. And you can use something called the EV comp to see whether or not you're exposed to that point. It'll tell you as a meter, and then you can also just look at the back of the camera. Can you see the sky? Can you see the ground? Are things blown out in different ways? White balance you really don't want to have set to auto. You want to set it to, first of all, match whatever other cameras are doing on site, or to whatever looks the most normal in the environment. So oftentimes 5500 Kelvin right here is what you're going to be using. If you're indoors, it usually ends up being a little bit of a cooler temperature that you need. 5500 Kelvin is typically where you're going to be. You can leave your white balance to auto, but I've had really weird things, especially in like Red Rock Canyon in Las Vegas. For whatever reason, I was filming there, and because the rocks are so red, the camera starts to try to add in green with auto white balance to try to counteract that, and you end with these weird situations where like the camera is like super, like everything that you see is super green, even though it's not supposed to be, and that's because I didn't have the white balance locked. ISO minimum at 100, that's the lowest, and then you want to have your maximum pretty much at any point no higher than 800. If you can, lock it to the exact setting that you use. So you can use your shutter speed and your ISO to control your shutter. So for example, sometimes putting an ND filter over top of the lens will not give you enough. Oh, here, maybe this is a little bit better exposure value for me. Maybe we need one of these right now. But if you set one of these over top of your lens and say it's too dark, so say your ND16 seems to be too dark, but your ND8 is too bright, you can put on an ND16 to make it too dark and then use ISO just a little bit to increase it. So typically what you want to do is have your ISO min and max locked in, because that's going to force the GoPro to not change exposure. It's not going to get brighter or darker at any given moment. It's always going to have that exposure value that you're supposed to have. I run sharpness on medium or low. All it's doing is artificially adding sharpening in the software side of it. It's not something that is necessarily good or bad, but I figure if you need it to be sharper later, just use your Premiere, your Final Cut Pro, whatever, instead of that. Color profile flat, it gives you a little bit more dynamic range, a little bit more options in terms of making the color look more normal. And then I don't really mess with the audio settings at all. They don't matter once you have prop noise added in. And then all these shortcuts, leave them the same, and boom. That is our primary real steady setup. It's 2.7K 4x3 at 60 frames per second with a wide lens. Something that's really helpful to do is to go into your orientation and have it locked there, so that when you like flip the camera over, it doesn't rotate on you. And if you ever end up accidentally recording the camera in a vertical point, sometimes real steady won't work. You have to get some extra programs to make that content actually usable. So some other typical settings that I'll run on the GoPro, for the most part I'll use all of those same exposure settings and color settings and all those things, but I'll just change the frame rate or how I want to film. So like if I'm feeling lazy or I'm just filming something for YouTube or just having fun, I'll use super view. I'll go 5K 30, lens as wide as it'll go, or sometimes I might go 4K 30 so I can get that super view lens, the 16mm really wide angle. And then I typically put hyper smooth 3.0 just on, not necessarily boost, just on, and then everything else is the same. So if I really am going try hard mode, I will put on an ND filter, set my shutter angle. If I'm just out flying for fun or I'm just catching a little freestyle, I might not necessarily go all the way and set my GoPro settings to like the most extreme versions of what I have available, like I do for filming purposes, just because you break ND filters, you don't necessarily know the kind of environment that you're flying in. You're less intentional about the shot that you're getting. So I might just leave it on auto and have it do normal stuff like that. And then another thing that I've been asked to shoot in a lot lately is linear mode. So when you have a super wide angle lens like you do with the GoPro, the subject that you're filming can get a little bit distorted, especially when you get really close to it. By having a wide angle and pushing the camera up really close to something, it's going to kind of like it would make my nose look really big if I had a really wide camera pointed up to it, just for example. And so the same thing happens with the GoPro. So with that, I've been asked a few times to film in linear mode, which actually means I have to stay a little bit further back, and I'll be a little bit more mindful of my framing, because it's a much narrower field of view. But again, use all the same exposure settings, put on an ND filter, all that good stuff. And then I'll typically have a option for super slow-mo stuff. Super slow-mo stuff just ends up looking really cool, like, you know, chucking a frisbee and following the frisbee really close and getting that, you know, making that moment extend. So either, you know, 1080 240 or 120. I'll use super view on, lens wide, hyper smooth on. You might be able to use real steady on 240, but at that point, you know, you might as well just get it in camera and enjoy. I hope that all of these GoPro settings were really useful to you. I hope that they can benefit you in your journey to shoot better video with FPV, or however you're using your GoPro. Maybe you're not even doing FPV. I'm really glad that I've learned so much about this over the years, and that I can share that back with you. Once again, please consider liking and subscribing and all of that obnoxious YouTube stuff, and stay flying.